This Notebook LM video explores how Christianity began as a Jewish sect and was initially labeled a heresy. In the 1st century, the term heresis simply meant a school of thought or choice, not an insult. The word was used to describe groups like the Pharisees and Sadducees, and even the Apostle Paul admitted his movement was called a heresy.
All right, so what if I told you that Christianity didn't actually start as a totally new religion? That instead it began as a pretty controversial movement inside of Judaism, a movement that its own critics called a heresy. Yeah, today we're going to dig into that surprising and honestly often misunderstood story of how Christianity really began. So, a Jewish heresy? Okay, let's just dive right in. You know, the story we usually hear is that Christianity just broke away from Judaism, simple as that. But the real history, it's way, way more complicated. For its first 100 years or so, the Jesus movement was seen by pretty much everyone, insiders and outsiders alike, as a sect within Judaism, a Jewish heresy. So this is the big question, right? Was Christianity born as a heresy? To get to the bottom of this, we've got to go back to the source. And you're not going to believe this, but one of the most important early Christian leaders, well, he tackles this accusation head on. So check this out. The Apostle Paul is on trial. He's literally defending his beliefs to save his own skin. And he says this, "But this I confess unto thee, that after the way which they call heresy, so worship I the God of my fathers." Now, what he's doing here is just fascinating. He doesn't deny it. He's like, yeah, they're calling my movement a heresy. But then in the very next breath, he insists he's worshiping the God of my fathers and believes everything in the Jewish scriptures. He's basically arguing, hey, this isn't some new religion. This is the real continuation of my ancestral faith. All right, section 2, sects, not insults. So to really get what Paul is saying there, we have to totally hit the reset button on what we think the word heresy means. Because back in the 1st century, it didn't mean what it means today, not even close. Okay, the original Greek word was heresies. And back then, it was a completely neutral term. Seriously, it just meant a choice, or a school of thought, or maybe a sect. It wasn't an insult. It was just how you describe any particular group that had its own distinct philosophy. It was more like saying, oh, you're from that school of thought. And this is the absolute key to understanding everything. 1st century Judaism was not one single thing. It wasn't a monolith. It was this vibrant, kind of messy landscape of different sects, different heresies, all passionately debating what it meant to be Jewish. You had the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, the Zealots, all these groups. And in that context, the first followers of Jesus, who were called the Nazarenes, they were just one more voice in what was basically a very loud, very lively family argument. Okay, next up, the core disagreements. So if the Jesus movement started out as just another Jewish sect, what happened? I mean, how did it go from being a neutral school of thought to a dangerous heresy? Well, it all came down to a few fundamental disagreements about theology, disagreements that just became impossible to patch up. And look, these weren't minor squabbles. They struck right at the heart of the faith. Let's break them down. First, you've got the whole Messiah question. The mainstream Jewish expectation was for a human king, a leader who would fulfill some very specific world-changing prophecies, like right now. The Christian claim that Jesus was the Messiah, sure, but he was also divine and would fulfill the prophecies in 2 stages. That's a huge difference. Second, the nature of God himself. The absolute bedrock of Judaism is strict monotheism. God is one, and he doesn't have a body. So this developing Christian idea of a triune God, and especially of God becoming a human being, that was seen as a radical, almost unthinkable departure. And finally, the big one, the role of the Jewish law, the Torah. The decision that non-Jewish converts didn't need to follow all the ritual laws, that was a game changer. It was a major break from what it meant to be part of the covenant. So let's talk about the parting of ways, because these deep theological tensions, they didn't just bubble up in a vacuum. No, they were thrown into a pressure cooker by one single, absolutely catastrophic historical event. An event that forced both sides, the emerging rabbinic Judaism and the early Christian movement, to figure out who they were, and it sped up what historians now call the parting of the ways. That event happened in the year 70 CE. It was the Roman destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem, and you really can't overstate how big of a deal this was. This was an absolutely earth-shattering moment. The very center of Jewish worship and identity was just gone. In the aftermath, Judaism had to completely reinvent itself, shifting its focus to rabbis and sacred texts. But for the Christians, well, they already believed that Jesus was the new spiritual temple. So for them, this destruction just reinforced their belief that their path was now separate from a faith centered on a physical building in Jerusalem. It was a shared trauma, but it pushed them onto two totally different paths. And this timeline, it really drives the point home. This split didn't happen overnight. It was a slow, pretty painful process that stretched out over more than a century. It all starts around 30 CE, with Jesus' ministry. It's just an internal Jewish debate at this point. Then boom, 70 CE, the temple is destroyed. That's the catalyst that changes everything. Fast forward to about 90 CE and you get a really key development called the Birkat Haminim. This was a Jewish prayer that included a line against heretics, and most scholars think this was designed to formally exclude Jewish Christians from the synagogue. The line in the sand is being drawn. And by the time you get to around 160 CE with texts like Justin Martyr's dialogue, the split is basically complete. The two communities see each other as fundamentally separate, and that view of Christianity as a heresy, it's now totally solidified. All right, our final section, two faiths, one origin. So we've looked at the language, the theology, the history. What's the big takeaway here? What does all this really mean? It's really this. Christianity wasn't just born out of nowhere. It came from a messy, complicated, and often painful family argument right inside the Jewish world of the first century. You had this argument, fueled by these huge, irreconcilable ideas about God and the Messiah. Then it was fractured by the trauma of war and the temple's destruction. And eventually, the gap just grew so wide that the family members couldn't live in the same house anymore. What started as one faith tradition slowly, painstakingly evolved into two. And understanding the shared and very conflicted origin, it isn't just some boring academic exercise. It really forces us to ask a crucial question for today. How does knowing that these two great world faiths began not as strangers, but as estranged family, how does that change the way we see their relationship right now? It's a really powerful question to sit with. Thanks for joining me on this.